Please take your seats if you're able. Wind down your vibrant conversations, talking about everything we just learned. Thank you so much for returning and being with us for this second section. I want to say a special thanks to our audience joining us online. Special shout out to any Intro to Native American Studies students. I see you, Maddie. And maybe online who are from my class who get some extra credit for attending. Thank you for joining us both virtually and in person. For our next panel, unfortunately, I have the sad news that our panelist, Alyssa Mount Pleasant, was not able to join us today due to illness. We are sending her our well wishes and hope she's recovering speedily. I am now pleased to welcome the moderator for our next panel, Ned Blacklock. Take it away.
Let me just extend my continued appreciation for the invitation to be a part of this, remarkable and dare I say historic gathering. I'm learning so much and looking forward to both the findings of the 1817 project and continued conversations about other institutional undertakings that are going to, immeasurably benefit from the work and engagements that are occurring here in Ann Arbor and throughout our weekend together. As our program outlines, this session is called Universities and Indigenous Dispossession. I don't have access to the PowerPoint, but I hope John, oh, there we go. Good, John's is going to start us. And I think our program suggests that this panel will explore the deep links between colonization, indigenous dispossession, and the growth of colleges and universities in the United States, continuing the outstanding insights that we just enjoyed and benefited from throughout our morning first session. It is my distinct pleasure to be sharing the stage this morning with two extraordinary scholars, John Parmenter. I'll introduce you both, and then I'll invite John to the stage, or to the podium. John Parmenter is a historian of early America who specializes in the history of indigenous peoples of the Northeast, particularly the Haudenosaunee, or often referred to as Iroquois Confederacy. His Edge of the Woods, Iroquois from 1534 to 1701, as we were just discussing, is one of the only academic histories of recent generation that examines the 16th century in the Northeast. An extraordinary undertaking if you think about it, given the lack of actual European settlements in the Northeast during that period. He has written extensively in the field, publishing in prominent journals, and is a professor of history at Cornell University. And his current project is called Dispossess, Cornell University's Origins in Indian Country, which explores the ongoing legacy of institutional profit-taking from indigenous lands in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Kansas, both for the university and for 9 directly impacted Native nations. After John, we'll be hearing from Mary Shee, who is an LNSA Collegiate Fellow and incoming Assistant Professor of Sociology here in Ann Arbor. Her dissertation in sociology at UC Berkeley won the very prestigious American Studies Association dissertation prize, and then she's turning that project into her current book manuscript undertaking, tentatively titled A Settler Republic, which puts land and infrastructure promotion at the center of American state formation to make visible the colonial origins of the American administrative and developmental state. Her first book project was the collaboratively produced Counterpoints about the Bay Area's history of displacement and resistance. Please join me in welcoming John to the stage.
Thanks very much to Ned, and thanks very much to the organizers. I'm really grateful for the hospitality that the university where I did a PhD a generation ago has extended. What I'm going to offer you today is a reflection on Cornell's land acknowledgement and what I'm going to argue is something of the dissonance between that and what you might call accountability. And I think already one of the things that I've had the pleasure of experiencing here are lessons that I think I will take back with me to Ithaca, where I think you'll agree we have a fair bit of work to do. Okay, so we'll get started here. Cornell adopted its current land acknowledgement in May of 2021 after consultation with the traditional leadership of the Gayacono, also known as Cayuga Nation, led by faculty in the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. The version of the land acknowledgement most often heard at campus events acknowledges Cornell's presence on ancestral Gayacono territory and the continuing relationship of Gayacono people to those lands and the surrounding waters. Okay. Since you'll notice on that particular screenshot there that comes from Cornell University's Commitment to Indigenous Communities and Nations in North America page, the little tab that says History. Okay, and you have to hover over that to get to what comes next. Okay, what comes next is a very different kind of language that reflects to some extent what we've learned since May of 2021 about another category of former Indigenous lands significant to the university's history, the real estate in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Kansas obtained by Everett Cornell under the auspices of the Morrill Act of 1862 and later sold by the university to build much of the Ithaca campus. The American Indian and Indigenous Studies program added an addendum to the land acknowledgement to address the impact of the Morrill Act in Indigenous Dispossession in 2022. To date, the university's official effort to address this relationship amounts to what you see on the screen there. Okay, I have never heard this version spoken aloud by any university representative, and more problematically, that written supplement misrepresents Cornell's financial benefit from these 19th century dispossessions as a phenomenon confined to the past when it's in fact ongoing. So this is a scatter map of the holdings that the university actually acquired from the Morrill Act. I've differentiated this from the scrip sales because these are the lands that the university actually acquired, held, and managed as a speculative real estate investment for the better part of 70 years. Okay, there's the ties to particular treaty surrenders there. You can see the bulk of it is centered in the northern part of Wisconsin. This amounts to about 500,000 acres of former Indigenous land held by Anishinaabe, Dakota, Ho-Chunk, Osage, and Kansa or Kaw people. Okay, and one of the struggles that I've had, one of the things that's kind of bothered me since we've been working on this is the perpetual question of what was this worth? Okay, as Ned said, you know, I work on a much earlier period of history. This is not something that came naturally to me. I had to do some learning, but here's what I learned. Okay, so one of the things that you need to do to understand this history is talk a little bit about how you convert currency historically. And I was aided to a great extent by a peer-reviewed website called measuringworth.com. And if you ever want to go and figure out how to do this, I would highly recommend that place. So what I've found is that over time, the revenues from the Morrill Act account for at least $685 million in 2025 US dollars, or about 6% of the university's current $11.8 billion endowment. That might seem like a small fraction, but I want you to consider that 1/7 of that money accrued to the university in just 8 years after 1881, largely from the sale of pine timberlands in northern Wisconsin. This represented the sole source of revenue that rescued the university from near certain bankruptcy and catapulted it into the ranks of the nation's largest endowed institutions of higher learning. I can also say with certainty that in 2008, the capital account containing the principal of accrued income from the university's Morrill Act lands paid out in interest the equivalent of at least $4 million in 2025 US dollars in unrestricted funds. What that payout might be today, some 17, 18 years later, I cannot say because the university has denied my written request for this information. It was public information until 2008. Apparently that's no longer the case. So how did I come up with these numbers? Okay, and the table there is a sample from a spreadsheet that took me quite a long time to assemble, identifying the different streams of revenue that come in from the Morrill Act by analyzing the university's financial reports adding the sum of those revenue streams in a particular year to get a total income figure for that year, and then converting that year into a total, and then taking over the far right column, Excel, added that all up, and we get ourselves to a baseline estimate of $685 million. I want to stress here that I'm using the lowest possible inflator on the website. There's 7 different options you can plug in for the value of a US dollar historically. I used the GDP deflator measure, which is the most modest speculative example. And you know, I did not make any provisions for the accrual of interest here, because when this money came in every year from the Morrill Act, it went into general operating expenses. And to the best of my knowledge, the annual payouts are unrestricted money that are spent every year by the university. So in light of this, I think it's important to ask what's happened since the adoption of the land acknowledgement. And while I'd be remiss not to recognize some recent positive developments, such as the efforts of faculty in the American Indian and Indigenous Study program and the university's linguistics department to help revitalize the endangered Guyakona language, it's also important to point out less encouraging trends at our university since 2021. Enrollment of Native students, Native American students in the class of 2028 declined to a mere 1% of the whole, and by one metric, there are only 4 Native American students enrolled in Cornell University's class of 2029. That's about 1 in 1,000. Retention of Indigenous faculty at our university is proving to be an increasing challenge. A thoughtful and innovative proposal put forward by one of my colleagues in January of 2024 to establish a small Guyakona land base at one of Cornell's teaching forests in upstate New York has been ignored. At this very moment, Cornell's American Indian and Indigenous Studies program is facing a quite significant budget cut due on July 1st. How that will impact its multifaceted academic and student services mission is anyone's guess. I want to spend the rest of my time here talking a little bit about another particular example that I myself have been involved with since March of 2024. Oh, and that's the statistics there. I forgot to move that slide. So that basically shows you the metrics and the mechanics of what's going on here. There are multiple millions of dollars, I don't know how many, coming into the university every year from this to this day. Okay, and I think that's the takeaway point I'd like you to kind of have with me. What I want to talk about now is an effort that I've been working on since March of 2024 with Dr. Rick St. Germain of the Lekudere Anishinaabe community to try and persuade the university to transfer its reserved mineral rights on a parcel of land, a former Morrill Act parcel in Barron County, Wisconsin, that contains a sacred pipestone quarry listed on the National Register of Historic Places as the Wajuan Meshkota National Archaeological District. The transfer of rights from the university would provide the Lekudere community with a legal stake in the land, and the ideal outcome here would be a negotiated memorandum of understanding with the surface owner to ensure stable and sustainable community access to the quarry, which has been interrupted since the university's acquisition of the property in 1867. And you can see on the slide there a quote from our university's Western Land Records collection that explains to you the mechanism of how this worked. Okay, this is from Ezra Cornell's agent in Wisconsin, a guy named William Woodward, and it indicates that the university knew exactly what it was selecting when it did. Okay, they tried unsuccessfully for about 70 years to develop the quarry into a commercial production, but eventually the financial strains of the Great Depression compelled its sale in 1938, the very last Morrill Act parcel that the university retained as real estate. But when they sold the property, the university maintained a 50% mineral interest in the acreage, as it did with nearly 150,000 other acres of former Morrill Act land in northern Wisconsin. And you can see in the quote there that there is a reference in the text to Hole in the Day. That is a picture of Chief Hole in the Day. That is a pipe. I don't know if it's the pipe they're talking about. The pipe that they're talking about was supposed to come back to Ezra Cornell's possession. It is nowhere to be found in the university's holdings, but the story was there. Okay, this is a significant resource for the Anishinaabe of northern Wisconsin. Okay, the stone, as Dr. St. Germain explained it, has some very unique properties. It's soft when it's in the ground, and when it comes out, it stays soft until about 2 or 3 hours of contact with air. That makes it ideal for carving, and its most common use is for making pipes that are used in the Madiwan ceremony. Okay, and there's some images of it there that are courtesy of the State Archaeologist of Wisconsin's office. The Milwaukee Public Museum created this postcard in the 1920s, sort of depicting indigenous use of the quarry. It's an old picture, I know, but it gives us sort of a sense of things. And this is an image of the site as it exists today. It's a fairly modest place. It's out in the woods, and I got lost trying to find it one time. So it was interesting. Okay, if I hadn't had cell service, I might still be there. So despite urgent appeals on 2 occasions in 2024 for the university to transfer its mineral rights interest on the quarry, which I would add here represents less than 0.1% of the university's entire Morrill Act mineral rights portfolio in Wisconsin, to its appropriate indigenous caretakers, we've received no formal institutional response. The urgency here stems from the fact that the knowledge keepers and practitioners associated with the quarry in the Lakudere community are all of advanced age, many in their 80s, and without secure access to the site, the transmission of that knowledge to succeeding generations is at risk. Okay, and I think that explains some of the urgency here. I'm going to skip ahead. We were interviewed by the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel in August of 2025. That news article elicited only a no comment from Cornell's Vice Provost for Engagement and Land Grant Affairs. 2 subsequent emails written by myself regarding the quarry issue, one to the president of our Board of Trustees on September 10th, 2025, and a follow-up to the general intake email account for the Board of Trustees on December 17th, 2025, have not been answered. Given the facts above, it's difficult to escape the conclusion that Cornell's senior leadership believes that it's done its part by adopting the land acknowledgement. No further discussion of the university's historical and structural relationship to Indigenous dispossession appears to be forthcoming. That silence has been deafening and disappointing. With each passing day, Cornell falls further behind, not only its Ivy League peers grappling with past entanglements with slavery, its land-grant university peers addressing their institutional relationships with Indigenous dispossession via the Morrill Act of 1862, other colleges and universities in New York State that have taken significant steps to build productive relations with neighboring Haudenosaunee nations. We can add the University of Michigan to that list, and here we are, okay? So the point I want to conclude with here is that, like it or not, Cornell University's past, present, and future are all linked inextricably to foundational acts of Indigenous dispossession by the United States federal government, from which the university continues to benefit, while Indigenous communities nearby and distant await a fuller measure of justice. So we're living with treaties to a certain degree at Cornell, but we're also living with legislation, the Morrill Act of 1862. Cornell's land acknowledgement represents a critical first step toward reparative action and an implicit invitation for the university to do more, but it's no substitute for the kind of meaningful partnerships that could be formed with Indigenous nations impacted directly by the university's role in their ongoing alienation from sacred sites and other ancestral territories. And until university officials decide to move beyond self-congratulatory rhetoric about Cornell's status as the only land-grant Ivy, and to prioritize such relationships, we have to rely on the land acknowledgement as an entry point for people to learn more about Cornell's part in the persistent displacement of Indigenous peoples, while simultaneously taking in multiple millions of dollars of unrestricted income annually from those very practices, and to keep us thinking about how we can promote greater accountability for the institution's historical and ongoing extractive relationship to Indigenous lands and resources. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Shai. I am LSA Collegiate Fellow here at the University of Michigan and incoming Assistant Professor of Sociology, also here at the University of Michigan. I want to start with first saying thank you to our conference organizers for putting together this wonderful event and also inviting me here. My understanding of what my role in this conference was to give you a little bit of the broader history of the role of land and native dispossession and erasure in kind of what I would call the origins of the American developmental state, right? How these lands were funneled into, as we've been talking about, higher education, but also railroads, canals, et cetera. And I hope, after my brief presentation, after which I hope we can have a robust conversation, a robust Q&A, you guys will see how deep these connections are, how interlinked these histories are, and understand a little bit of maybe the documentary and legal history, as well as financial history of these entanglements. Right, so a lot of the context of our conversation so far has been happening through discussions of the 1862 Morrill Land Grant Act, which transferred ultimately over 11 million acres of lands to support colleges for, quote, the act was titled "For the Benefit of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts." Right? And we've been discussing how the University of Michigan is a precursor to this act established in 1816, not exactly part of this act, but also part of this broader history of using land to finance higher education in the United States. I want to put that history in the history of also another history that we might be kind of passingly familiar with, but deserves more attention, which is the history of using land grants to finance infrastructure, what we would now call infrastructure in the United States. So most Americans are at least passingly familiar with the idea that the first transcontinental railroad was financed in part by grants of what were called alternating sections of land all along its route. And this kind of grant of alternating sections of land, those, like square sections of land, produced this very characteristic checkerboard pattern of public and private land that we now see all across the American West. So this is a history also that Americans are roughly familiar with, right? Like land grant colleges, alternating sections for railroads. What I want to kind of impress on folks here today is that these two phenomenon, in the mind of 19th century Americans, they were intimately linked, right? In the 19th century, schools, as much as turnpikes, canals, railroads, they were all kind of under the umbrella category, loosely defined, of what early 19th century Americans called internal improvements. And to kind of give you a sense of what I mean when I say they thought of all these things together, here we see this lithograph from Francis Palmer, published in 1868, where we see, maybe the first thing you notice is this railroad kind of triumphantly heading out into an empty West. Notice that the West is empty. The Native American people depicted in the lithograph are on the side already, left behind by this railroad, right? But if you look a little bit more closely at this image, you see that in the exact same image, Francis Palmer, the buildings that she shows here, the settlement, they're not just buildings. One of the buildings here is a public school. Like this is prominently depicted in the front of this image, right? So in the 19th century, these kinds of internal improvements, canals, railroads, schools, they were all kind of thought of as working together to promote maybe not what we would now call economic development, which is how we think of these public works today, but maybe something more like the moral progress, the civilizational progress of American people, the American nation. And we kind of get a sense of this, both how foundational this idea was to American founding, but also how this was not yet what we would now call economic development from items like the Northwest Ordinance, which we've already kind of briefly touched on the Northwest Ordinance in some different presentations. But I want us to think of the Northwest Ordinance, which provided a blueprint for the incorporation of territories in the American West as free states on equal political footing with the United States. The Northwest Ordinance is often, kind of celebrated as an example of how early Americans envisioned an empire for liberty, an empire of equal states. From another perspective, it was also completely just a blueprint for American colonization, right? And Article 3 of the Northwest Ordinance wrote that given that religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government, again, not the economy, and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Right, so this is a document that is passed before our Constitution is even passed. Like, this is really one of the founding documents of the United States, and we already see that commitment to education for moral purposes in this document. Now, this document I would call an unfunded mandate. The Northwest Ordinance does not exactly say how we're meant to do this, how we're meant to encourage schools, but it's clear, Article 3, it's clear that it should be happening. Another kind of early historical example I want to put on the table for you guys is this brief quote from Thomas Jefferson's second inaugural address, which he gave in 1805, where Jefferson argued that surplus revenues, federal revenues, should be applied to, quote, rivers, canals, roads, arts, manufactures, education, and other great objects within each state. Again, we can see how these different types of projects, which we might not think of as the same thing today, they were all kind of within this framework of internal improvements for the early 19th century. And this quote is important not just because it demonstrates that there are quotes like this all over that kind of show how these things are bundled together, but this quote is also important because Thomas Jefferson in this early period, he was one of the loudest proponents of limited government, of small government, of government not, getting its fingers in private enterprise, and even things like public schools, like maybe that should be something for cities or townships or states. Thomas Jefferson is here saying, no, this is, he comes around. That's also what he's saying earlier in his career. He comes around by 1805 and says, you know what, when we have surplus money, we should apply them to internal improvements, right? So, in terms of, like we're here at the Living with Treaties conference at the University of Michigan, before I show you exactly how they're going to fund that unfunded mandate, which, not surprisingly, it's going to be land, indigenous land, I wanted to briefly draw our attention to the fact that there is a giant inscription at the top of Angel Hall. This is an image of Angel Hall on central campus of the University of Michigan. It's pretty faded at this point. Almost no one can read it. But if you can read it, what you will find is actually this exact language from the Northwest Ordinance. What is on Angel Hall is the Northwest Ordinance, right? And recall Angel Hall, named after that University of Michigan president that was quoted earlier by Professor Cook, right? So this history, again, even though the University of Michigan is not a Morrill Land Grant Act, right? Like, it is in its very kind of like the concrete, the bones, the stones of this university is tying itself to and memorializing this broader history of internal improvement promotion in the United States, right? So it's giant. I don't mean like it's like on a corner of the building, right? It's that whole thing at the top of the building. So if you after our session today, right when you walk outside of Michigan Union, you can see Angel Hall to your left. You can take a look. Right, so how was this unfunded mandate finally funded? Here I have some excerpts from the 1800 Act enabling kind of giving congressional approval for what would be the Ohio Constitutional Convention. So it's important to remember that Ohio was the first state to be carved out of the Northwest Territory. So if we think of the Northwest, Northwest Ordinance as a blueprint for American colonization, Ohio is the first, kind of like trial run of how that's going to work. And when Congress says, okay, like, yeah, well, you guys have met those population requirements, you guys look good, you guys can become a state, you guys can hold your convention, they send this act back with only 3 kind of like suggestions on what Ohio should keep in mind. And of those 3 suggestions, 2 of them are about these internal improvements, right? So the first is that the 16th section of every township should be reserved for the use of schools, right? So this is how we finally fund that unfunded mandate. And again, just kind of speaking to how these different projects were intertwined in the minds of these early 19th century Americans. Congress also suggests that 1/20 of the net proceeds of the lands sold within the state of Ohio, what will become the state of Ohio, be reserved for the use of building roads, right? And this language, in particular the roads language, it gets amended, changed slightly. This language is ultimately what provides funding, kind of startup funding, you could say, for what becomes the Cumberland Road, which is finally approved in 1806. And maybe more importantly, for not just thinking about the history of early infrastructure projects, the history of the Cumberland Road, this language about reserving some percentage of public land sales for transportation infrastructure gets kind of copy-pasted all over Western states and is the basis of what some people call the 3% fund, which is, again, that portion of public land sales that's meant to, in state constitutions funnel directly into infrastructure construction. So these are the two things that Congress tells Ohio it should do. Otherwise, it's like, you guys are free people. You do what you want, but please do these two things, right? Please promote internal improvements with land, with land. So far, right, like I've been trying to show you how direct grants of lands, appropriated fractions of proceeds from public land sales helped finance early internal improvements. I want to point now out real quickly here that to understand this process, we can't just look at like the money, like that's part of the story. But the other part of the story is also kind of the discursive tools, the language, the symbols, the assumptions that are woven into how this land is used, debated, kind of dreamt about, like before it even gets successfully appropriated, how assumptions of indigenous erasure also helped financialize these lands, right? So again, thinking about this really, really early period, as I kind of alluded to earlier, there were really like knockdown, drag out debates over the constitutionality of federal intervention in internal improvements in this earlier time period. And Thomas Jefferson is, one of those figures that you can see. He goes from like not supporting them to supporting them. In this like very contentious period, one very early influential report, suggestion, proposal for how the federal government could build a national system of internal improvements, canals, railroads, turnpikes, et cetera, comes from Albert Gallatin, published in, he authors this report in 1808. And this report is significant because it shows how Gallatin used assumptions of indigenous erasure to help kind of make what sounded like an impossibly expensive, and impossible to actualize project possible. Because in his proposal for like this nationally integrated system of internal improvements, he says, okay, how are we gonna pay for this? He never mentions new taxation, right? Like the country is founded on like a tax revolt. So he doesn't go to taxation. He says, what we have conveniently is 100 millions of acres of land available in the Northwest Territory that we can sell to seed an internal improvements fund to kind of get his venture started. Of course, as we've been kind of seeing in all these other presentations, this report is published in 1808. That is before the majority of the treaties that we've been talking about. And that Treaty of Greenville, that is not a cession of native lands. That's a recognition of American sovereignty, right? Like at this time period, 5 years later, for example, there is another Treasury report that says there are only 50 million acres of land in the Northwest Territory where native title has been extinguished, right? So like Albert Gallatin, who is the Treasury Secretary, is kind of throwing out these wild numbers as if the United States already has access to these lands as a financial resource. But he notes, he's Treasury Secretary, he knows that this is not true. But this assumption of indigenous erasure is helping him build this financial vision, this vision of internal improvements in America. We see pretty much the exact same process with the funding debates behind the Erie Canal, which the Erie Canal is kind of, which is approved in 1817 and starts to kind of operate in 1822. It's the project that convinces Americans, and not just Americans, but also like Europeans, all of the Northern Atlantic, that infrastructure should be used to promote economic development ahead of settlement. Like you build it into empty land so people will come, not that you build it where people already live so you can help them move things around like coal in Britain. The Erie Canal is this, when they're discussing it, again, seemingly impossible project, longer than the then longest canal in the Western world, which is the Canal du Midi in France, built, to nowhere, in settlers' minds, empty land. The canal commissioners Ultimately, it's paid for in kind of a complicated way that I'm happy to discuss in our Q&A, but an earlier initial proposal for the Erie Canal after the federal government says, never mind, we can't be involved for, again, reasons I can talk more about in the Q&A. The state legislators say, okay, so if we're not going to get federal money, why don't we sell all of the land in Western New York? Because again, this is a state that has sizable Western land holdings, and that will generate $120 million, and that we can use to finance the canal. And in their report, they explicitly say, if we sell all of the lands, all of the quote unappropriated lands in Western New York, including that of the Indian reservations, right? Like again, just an assumption that this land will become inevitably available, then we can finance the canal, right? So we see how indigenous erasure, not just the dispossession, but the rhetorical erasure of Native peoples was also important to these financial schemes. So as we've been kind of talking about in this conference, we've learned how land in the form of land grants was used to finance what we would now call economic development. In the case of the 1862 Morrill Land Grant Act, that act would ultimately transfer 11 million acres of land and generate an estimated $495 million in endowments in 2022 dollars. The history of land grants for railroads is also much, much greater than just the Transcontinental Railroad, which is depicted here. By the passage of the Transcontinental Railroad, 63 million acres of land had been transferred to railroad companies, right? Like almost 6 times that Morrill Land Grant Act, and that figure includes 34.5 million acres transferred to the Union and Central Pacific Railroad companies, which is the private companies that built the Transcontinental Railroad. I hope I've also kind of given you a sense maybe of how revenue from land sales were also used to finance internal improvements through things like the Cumberland Road, the 3% grant, these schemes of Gallatin and Schuyler and Porter to use money from land sales as development finance. Oftentimes the way that would exactly work is that, like the revenues would come into the general fund of a state or the federal government, and then the state or the federal government would purchase stock subscriptions in these private companies, right? So a lot of, when people, like one of the critiques that you'll get when you make this kind of argument is, no, these were private companies. It was, the Union Pacific was a private company. Railroads were mostly private companies, or this wasn't a federal project. Canals were state-led projects, they weren't federal projects. If you start looking at where the money behind those projects are, you'll see that oftentimes land sales revenues, or as Emily Connolly's work has demonstrated, which Ned mentioned briefly yesterday, kind of the principle of Indian trust funds were used to purchase stock subscriptions in these infrastructure projects. And when people say that, okay, land sales, like that's a tiny bit of federal revenue, well, there's actually historical statistics that show no, land revenue was a pretty substantial chunk of pre-Civil War federal revenue. On average, 8%, but obviously you can see it's extremely, extremely variable over this time period. But, like 8% is definitely not nothing. A. B, this land, these revenues are often used to support these projects when they're at their most fragile, their most experimental, at the origins of these projects. So when this land is available is extremely important. These land revenues are often specifically earmarked also for these development projects. So again, getting that history, the details of that history right shows that this really matters. And also, just like since we're taking a look at this chart, you'll see in terms of interpreting this very kind of variable chart, this giant spike in public revenue from land sales that's happening in the 1830s, that happens after the passage of there's a series of acts in the 1830s called the Preemption Acts, which allow settlers who had been illegally squatting on Western lands, often ahead of the extinguishment of Indian title, or just as frequently ahead of official surveying, right? In the 1830s, a series of acts were passed that allowed them to kind of make legal their squatting and purchase those lands finally. that is coincident with this giant spike of revenue, right? Like the federal government, like there's this backlog of money in a way that they get when they are able to legalize that squatting. So, and to kind of like conclude, when we think about the significance of these intertwined histories, I want us to not only think of native dispossession, indigenous erasure as kind of at the origins of the American higher education, but to the extent that, you know, railroads, canals, these ideas of kind of American technological prowess, the ideas that we have these like innovative incubators of entrepreneurs and hard workers, you know, in our higher education system to this day, that whole economic system is financed by indigenous erasure, by indigenous homelands, and by processes of indigenous dispossession. So incorporating that history requires more than just talking about higher education. It's a more foundational story about the history of the United States. Great, thank you.
Outstanding. We have, I think, half an hour for continued conversations. It'd be nice to perhaps incorporate some of the findings from this morning. I just wanted to just jump in very briefly and kind of continue some of the insights that Mary was offering, because your spike, Mary, coincides with the removal period of the South. And you may, and I know you're a sociologist by training and may not know the U.S. historiography as well as others in the room. But there's this extraordinary book by Claudio Sant called Unworthy Republic about the removal period, in which he shows that 40% of the U.S. entire GDP was used to remove Native peoples throughout the 1830s. It's conceivable that another dimension of your project could be that the sale of indigenous land is also fueling the construction of infrastructure designed to dispossess other Native peoples. So the levels of interpretive kind of engagement that these studies are offering really kind of force us to really reconsider our kind of foundational assumptions about the history of the antebellum republic, among other subjects. So in that vein and in that spirit, please feel free to ask away.
Hi, thank you very much for your talks. I guess my question is fairly broad and a bit of a bummer, and maybe directed to kind of thinking about the whole conference, which is to say we're holding these discussions about the uses of the sale of indigenous lands in the context of a political moment in which the federal government looks primed to liquidate public lands again, right? And I was wondering if, I mean, and maybe this is just a desperate cry for us to be talking about this openly, but like, how do we understand these histories in the context of a renewed effort to alienate federal lands? For example, like Trump in his election bid called for the erection of freedom cities on public domain lands. There are efforts to reorganize the U.S. Forest Service, for example, all that sort of stuff, right? So it seems like this crisis is returning, or it may be never has left. And I'd like to hear some thoughts on how do we understand these histories in this current context. Thank you.
I can start with that one. I take the fact that Trump proposed liquidating the public lands and then there being a massive public outcry against that, and he kind of tacoed his way out of that pretty quickly, actually as evidence that things change, right? And that we can kind of re-signify these material objects as well. Because pretty much every time public lands appear in development finance in the 19th century, I read that as shorthand for like a interconnected, extremely complex process of indigenous dispossession and erasure. And the public lands have been resignified to mean a lot of different things than that in the 20th and 21st centuries. And that's not to say that earlier history is not relevant. It's not that it's not still around, but that environmentalists, sportsmen, like Native communities were like, no, we're not going to do that, right? Like that's a sign also. That's a hopeful sign that like having these conversations does matter. We can resignify what these things mean and use them as new objects of organizing and imagining alternative futures.
I would echo that point, and just to say that I think one of the things that the discussions we've had here and some of the literature that's published out there shows us that for a long time, public lands were treated as a giant grab bag of free stuff. And I think what we're now realizing here in the 21st century is there's a lot of strings attached to so-called public lands, which we're now becoming more mindful of. My own university, as my employer, has an existential relationship to this. It's baked in the cake. It's not going away. And the question here is what do you do with that, right? Do you run away from it? I worked at Cornell for over 20 years before I actually understood this process. That's a little embarrassing as a historian. The time I have left, I want to dedicate to making sure everybody understands it because it's fundamental to what's happening here. And I think that in the particular case that I've talked about here with the Pipestone Quarry is the idea that you could try and take a tiny fraction of the residue of this whole process and just get something moving in the other direction. Okay, we're not trying to tackle the broader implications of this at a macro scale. Just start with something that's small, manageable, but incredibly meaningful to people, and see where it goes. Okay, and I think that's really the thing that keeps me going in the current moment, which can get pretty depressing at times. But you have to remind yourself that what you're dealing with here is it's the truth. Okay, it really is. It's the factual basis for the arrangements we inhabit today. So how you're going to accommodate yourself to that is a really important question, and it invites a lot of careful reflection that we don't always see happening.
Question in the back, but let me just kind of invite us to also think about the Native nations who are pushing for various forms of restitution. Much of our conversations so far have focused on the institutionals themselves, or the federal government, and so I just wanted to remind John, as he knows already well, that our in Connecticut, our nearby Mohegan neighbors have recently instituted a form of archival repatriation from Cornell's holdings of some of Sansom Occam's, one of their ancestors' printed material. So in Native nations and individuals are pushing for these things in so many myriad ways. And hopefully those kind of understandings help us understand these larger processes as well. And who's next?
Thank you so much for this panel and also the previous panel. I wanted to ask whether it might make sense to think of value as something that is historically constituted, something that is made rather than given. And this might be a way of extending the story of dispossession and fungibility to include the public. So maybe concretely the question is, how is the value of this land made? How is it advertised to people who don't already live there? Is it advertised, offered for sale within the United States, or is it also advertised for sale in other places like Europe, for example? So how is the value of this land made? Right? The land doesn't have an intrinsic value. It has to be created historically.
I can just speak to that briefly. Cornell University ran a storefront real estate agency in Eau Claire, Wisconsin for about 40, 50 years, where they marketed the land. The maps that the university had of its holding. And again, the primary object here was timber sales, as Michael pointed out. This is not prime settlement area, this is timber. And the university maintained granular focus on the value of these properties, surveying, taking counts of trees, the size of trees, and the sales were optimized at a level that it boggles the mind. The archival collection associated with Cornell's project is Cornell's Western Lands Project, as they referred to it, is a 68-box archival collection. Okay, with thousands of documents, surveys, letters. So this is an investment. This is a long-term hold. Mr. Cornell did not live to see the proceeds. He died. I think managing the process killed him, quite frankly. It was up to his successors, Henry Sage, and a couple other people at Cornell who sort of were able to leverage some information in the 1880s and start cashing this in at a moment when the university had eaten into a third of its endowment and was circling the drain. It was gone. Okay, and then it just sort of rose from the ashes. And university officials used to talk about this. You can go back into the trustees' proceedings, you can go back into the presidential addresses and see the cheerleading for this, if this was our salvation and awesome, and wow, that's not what we're seeing today. The reaction here is very, very different. It's a complete stonewalling. Nobody wants to talk about this. But the value that's added because the university held on to it and manipulated the sales to optimize its financial outcomes is really quite important. And as Michael, I think, pointed out, the disproportionate impact that had on those indigenous communities who had alienated much of this stuff in the 1830s. It took 50, 60, 70, 80 years of time for that land to get up to a point where the university could sell it for profit. So stuff that Mr. Cornell paid 60 cents an acre for was at times sold for $87 an acre, okay? And that's where all this money comes from.
I love the point that value is socially created. I just feel like I'm in a sociology department. So I guess I'd give two concrete examples to think through that. One is in Alexander Hamilton's 1790 Treasury report, his report on the public credit. He's kind of throwing out all these ideas about how the United States can refinance its Revolutionary War debt. And he says, the reason we can refinance our Revolutionary War debt is because we have all this free, unsettled Western land that European creditors will, of course, see that we will definitely grow, even though we're this young, like upstart nation that doesn't know what's doing. But we have all this land, so we can we'll get some investors, right? And that kind of rhetoric and that logic, again, it's that kind of indigenous erasure rhetoric that appears throughout the 19th century, right? So that's one way in which we can think of this value being created. Another is a process that happens, all over the American West, but is really beautifully and concretely and compellingly documented. And for example, like William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, you see that the first wave of settlers are often speculators. Like there's this tension throughout American history, like the congressional records that I, look a lot in, but also like how we tell national narratives, which is that American settlers are like the yeoman farmers, small independent farmers, homesteaders. But actually, the first wave of purchasers, there was often land speculators that were fighting to get in first. And over the course of kind of land policy in the United States, how successful they were, like varies over time. So I don't want to make a broad generalization. But that's just to say, the first wave of settlement, oftentimes the way that some of those land purchasers, many of those land purchasers made money was just real estate speculation. They bought larger tracts and then they subdivided them, and they said, canal's coming tomorrow, a railroad's coming next year. The value of this is going to go through the roof. And on one hand, that's development. That's, I guess, real estate development, but that's also real estate speculation. And we know it's, these are inflated values and these are speculative bubbles because, for example, in William Cronin's work, he documents kind of like the explosive increase in parcel values in what becomes Chicago and how that completely just kind of collapses in and on itself after the panic of, I believe, 1837. Yeah, so those processes are all over the story as well.
I'm through a past relationship with the Michigan State University Residential College of Arts and Humanities. I was taught about the relationship between Central Michigan University and the Chippewa tribe. And it was presented as a very positive thing and a forward growth. And given what we're learning here, I'm wondering if this is a smokescreen or a ruse, or if this is an example of a pathway to moving forward. So what they have done at Central Michigan University with the Chippewa tribe.
I don't know if any of our panelists can directly speak to that. institutional history. I'm sure some of our first session members, I don't want to presume this of either of you, but
Michelle Cassidy's here. She's on our advisory board. She teaches Native American history at Central.
but these are the types of kind of comparative institutional histories that this type of work really invites.
Yeah, I'm here, but I didn't necessarily prepare something. But what I can say is, no, it's okay, it's okay. What I can say is that it's an ongoing relationship that started in a historical moment from a place that maybe wasn't, as you're insinuating, like wasn't so positive in terms of the university was perpetuating stereotypes. And over time, though, they've worked with the Saginaw Chippewa to have a more meaningful relationship. And they are trying very hard to go beyond like land acknowledgements as well. And the university does that in different ways, but there's the Department of Indigenous Affairs that tries to work with federally recognized tribes and to encourage and support Indigenous students. And so the university, and I think because of this history, like very much wants to do that work, and faculty, because of the name, because of the Chippewa name too, there's more faculty in multiple departments who are willing to learn, but it is an ongoing process, and it's also one where Indigenous students continue to remind the university of like improvements that they can make. It's also one that is complicated by the fact that the Saginaw Chippewa are not the only Anishinaabe neighbors in the state, so that complicates it as well. But I'm just trying to think of what. So the university has had several like recent projects that they've been doing to also increase visibility on campus, which have been happening over the past like 5 years in terms of like language, a mural on campus. So like also just reminding people of history, including this history we've been talking about, like the treaty history is very visible in the CMU Union at a mural that we redid as part of like a committee that included Saginaw Chippewa members as well as Indigenous students and faculty. So that's what I can kind of say really quickly about that relationship.
Looks like Greg Dowd has someone in the back.
Hi, sorry, is this okay? Hi, I'm Ariella Ojibwe, and I'm a Sioux tribe member. And because I'm Anishinaabe, I care about water and the Huron River in particular. Today, we discussed the role of the public in the University of Michigan's land expansion policies and practices. So my question for you all right now is, what sort of responsibility do we, the public and the University of Michigan community, have to stand up against U of M's continued expansion today into communities who've asked them not to be there, such as with the Los Alamos and U of M data center partnership on undeveloped forested land, which was actually purchased from the railroad, on the Huron River in Ypsilanti Township, who've sent cease and desist notices. But not just in Ypsilanti, there are other places around Michigan and in the country that communities have asked U of M not to be, and they're doing projects. But this one is close to my heart, so I wonder what role we have as public, according to you.
Most of us don't have a U of M affiliations in the same ways that the first session did. But Mary, as our lone representative, will be charged with responding or maybe inviting comments from the audience.
I mean, I could say something really brief in general and probably deeply unsatisfying. So I do think it's I say this both, yeah, I guess to explain, but also as an invitation. Like, I've only lived in Ann Arbor for maybe like 14, 16 months, right? Like, I feel like I'm very new here. And one of the big threads of and I'm also very junior professionally, still a postdoc technically, right? One of the big threads of my academic, professional, scholarly development has been doing community engaged work. And Ned kind of briefly spoke to this when he mentioned my first book project, which was done with tenant organizers in the Bay Area. And one of the tensions that I've experienced within academia is that sometimes doing really local work, doing community engaged work, telling really local histories without pretensions to like make bigger histories, right? Like that doesn't always get celebrated or recognized. And I think one of the great strengths of the Inclusive History Project, but also how like the Living with Treaties, conference was specifically put together, is that it tries to celebrate and do and actively promote that kind of work. So that's just to say, I feel really new. My experience with community engaged work is it moves at the pace of trust. I feel like I'm still building those connections. I'm still learning how to plug in responsible ways. I feel really deeply committed though to like creating a university that creates space to do that, right? So that we can have those conversations and that they feel as central to a space like this as, some national history or something like that, right? So like, let's please continue to have a conversation because I'm like really open to learning and plugging in deeper.
I think I would just add that, as a public institution, you have access to publicly elected officials who can exert pressure on the institution in ways that don't exist for those of us who work at private institutions. You do have elected representatives, you do have people that the Board of Regents of the University of Michigan who decide on how money is spent, that is an avenue for people. I certainly don't want to presume to speak for anybody who works here, but that would be one thing that would occur to me if I was dealing with a public institution.
There, Greg, and then Gene.
Thank you both for such a such a great pair of talks. And I want to just make a comment on thank Mary for bringing up the front of Angel Hall, which I do look at regularly. And in fact, on the second floor of the LSA building in the dean's office, that is also inscribed on the wall, the Article 3, part of Article 3 of the 1787 Land Ordinance. I believe that, and I haven't Googled it, it'd be easy enough to do, but if you proceed down that Article 3, it then immediately talks about how the utmost good faith will be directed toward Indians, and except in the case of just wars. I mean, something along those lines. But thank you for referencing that. I'm wondering, John, if there are any allies for you who have worked through NAGPRA at Cornell. I mean, so one place where universities have been forced in many ways by law, and then before the law by Native activists, to engage with a form of restitution, at least, is through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And I wonder if there's any work
at
done
the moment, my understanding is that Cornell is just sort of completing its NAGPRA obligations, which is long overdue. It is being handled, to my knowledge, by the Office of the Vice Provost for Land Grant Affairs, where I currently don't have any allies.
Thank you. Thank you for terrific talks. I guess my question was, what happens when we put universities into the history of internal improvements in this very focused, self-conscious, critical way? What's really interesting to me, Mary shows, it was actually there at the beginning, right, in the Currier and Ives lithographs, in the federal legislation. It was certainly there, like in the 1804, land grant, imagining Michigan territory in a seminary of higher learning. But when I went to grad school and was reading things like George Taylor's The Transportation Revolution, there are no universities in there. It's just railroads, canals, turnpikes. That's changed. Like your work, Emily Connolly's work, Michael's work, it's changed. And now universities are squarely within this rubric, of 19th century internal improvements, which is this, as you've demonstrated, kind of brutal euphemism for this massive land and wealth and dispossession, process that's occurring across the 19th century. The second part of my question is that when you put universities into that history, what happens in relation to things like this, right? A conference, a self-critical institutional history, doing what John was describing as like the fact-based histories of the institutions to try to understand where they came from. I think one of the things we wrestle with a lot is that when you talk about repair or restitution or reparative actions, there's the like intergovernmental forms of reparations, like Germany after the Holocaust, paying reparations to Israel. But then there's also, like in the German case, they talk about like reckoning with the past, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, this kind of ongoing process of reckoning with the past. And I think a lot of what we're doing here, right, is this move of putting higher education, universities into the 19th century history of internal improvements, which then creates pressure, right, on the actual institutions, the universities, state governments, federal governments, to reckon with that past. And so they seem like separate processes, like the regents have the power of the purse. They can make decisions about what to do, right? Like about the data center, or the Huron River. But this kind of activity like creates these new forms of pressure, these new forms of awareness, institutional intelligence. I just wondered if you had thoughts about that.
I'll just speak briefly on that. That's a really great point. My initial response was it makes people really uncomfortable. And people a lot of times will shut down. And one of the things that I think you can see with the land acknowledgement is that it almost in a sense becomes a move to innocence, where people sort of want to consign something to a past and not talk about its current implications. So the issue we have at Cornell is interesting because we have the local Gayakono situation with the Cayuga people, but the people that I'm talking about are 1,000 miles away, okay? And it's out of sight, out of mind. And people, when they used to talk to me, the university administrators would say, well, what do you want? And I said, well, it's not about what I want. What I want you to do is to get some of those people here and ask them what a productive relationship would look like. I can't tell you what that is. It requires these conversations because the amazing thing is that after these whole processes of 19th century dispossession and whatever you want to call it, these people are still here, okay? And these communities exist and have issues. This is a university, a land-grant university that prides itself on solving real-world problems. Well, here you go, okay? I mean, it just seems pretty natural, okay? But there's a real investment in maintaining ignorance about these issues, because once you crack the nut, people have to deal with it. And you get the brand managers, the lawyers involved, and you have problems. So, I know that my efforts at the university are gonna outlive me, okay? I don't have any illusions about what I'm gonna achieve in my own time, but I wanna keep it going and I wanna get the awareness out there for people who someday might have the opportunity to do something with it, okay? To make sure that the story's known and told. So I'm at a little bit of a different stage. We are, I think, at Cornell than even here in terms of awareness raising and consciousness and investment by the university administration. I'll be honest with you, like seeing the leadership that's here is quite impressive. Coming from my institution, okay? So you're to be commended for that, and that's a great sign, I would say, for your future.
And I guess what I'd want to add to that really beautiful response is in terms of putting higher education in with transportation in like this bucket of internal improvements, I think that move asks us to kind of critically re-examine not just colleges, but like the whole American economic development model, which by the end of the 19th century, Sven Beckert, who's a historian at Harvard, he beautifully shows this in an article called American Danger. Other European colonial powers look to the United States and say, America got rich because they built all these railroads and they exploited the land in the West, right? So we should go and try that in Africa. That's what they do. That kind of like American model of development, like infrastructure, agricultural colleges, Morrill Land Grant Act, that's so central to how we think of American economic growth, and kind of the kind of narratives like entrepreneurialism and free market enterprise, all this stuff, right? I think if we integrate how in dispossession erasure is part of that history, we create more room to see that like our economic system is built with all these processes, and that, properly addressing the colonial history of the United States means not just kind of addressing kind of the moral status of our colleges or something like that, but like really reimagining economic systems and thinking about ways in which like the ways we are even financing things, right? Like has all these other relations embedded in those processes, and kind of like going back to the drawing board and asking these foundational questions. So that's kind of the move I hope people, that I hope that this work kind of creates some infrastructure towards making. And that's obviously a giant project. There's so much work to be done there, but the fact that we're together in spaces like this shows that maybe there's interest in space in trying to do some of that kind of work.
We've reached our delimited time limit. Please join me in thanking our panelists.